Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amherst Williams, the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of Museums, and I want to welcome you to today's Funding Spotlight with information about 1772 Foundation Historic Preservation Grants from Preservation Connecticut. We have with us today Mike Forino, who's the Field Service Director with Preservation Connecticut, based in Hamden. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work that Preservation Connecticut does, but Mike's going to be sharing a little bit more about that, as well as information about this this particular grant program for capital projects are focused on historic preservation. As I mentioned at the top, we'll be recording this. If you have any questions as we go, please feel free to pop them in the chat. We're going to hold most of the Q&A until Michael's finished his presentation, but I'll be monitoring the chat, and if anything is particularly on point, I might bring it up for Mike. And then we'll get to all questions at the end, including those in the chat, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions live. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand things over to Mike Forino from Preservation Connecticut. Mike, take it away.
Share my screen. Thank you, Amherst, for inviting me. And thanks everyone for being here. I saw lots of familiar names in the, oh, we just worked this out. There we go. Is that right? Good. Okay.
We got it.
All right, perfect. Yeah, thanks again for everyone being here. I was glad to see lots of familiar names in the attendee list, as well as new names. As Amherst said, I'm Mike Forino. I'm the Field Service Director at Preservation Connecticut, and for about the past 5 years, I've been the administrator of the 1772 grants here at Preservation Connecticut. Many of you probably know a lot about or something about our organization, but for those of you not familiar, Preservation Connecticut is our statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly. We have a staff of 8 preservation professionals, soon to be 9, who work every day to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the vitality and celebrate the heritage of Connecticut's communities. And for nearly 50 years, our big anniversary is coming up next year, we have successfully advocated for the protection of remarkable historic assets by leveraging funding, building community support, promoting partnerships like this one, and advocating for stewardship. I also want to tell you a little bit about the 1772 Foundation. It's a separate organization from ours. We can offer these grants because of the generosity of the 1772 Foundation. It was named in honor of its first restoration project, Liberty Hall in Union, New Jersey, which was built in 1772 by William Livingston, who was the first governor of New Jersey. And the residence was home to generations of the Livingston family, as well as generations of the Keene family, including Stuart Barney Keene, who was the founder of the 1772 Foundation in 1984. Since Mr. Keene passed away in 2002, the foundation grew from a $2.1 million private foundation with today having a endowment of over $80 million. And in the 20 years since Mr. Keene's passing, 1772 Foundation has given out about $60 million across the United States for preservation projects. Preservation Connecticut and the 1772 Foundation have been partnering since 2011. And in that time, we together have granted over $1.7 million in funding to some 200 nonprofit projects and leveraged an additional $3.5 million in funds for preservation work across the state. Okay, so first I want to just have a general overview of what the grant is and applicant eligibility requirements. The grants are for maintenance and repair of historic properties, and awards are up to $10,000 with no minimum award. The grant requires a 1-to-1 match, meaning that every dollar an applicant receives from the grant, they're required to put the same amount or more toward the project. The application for funding is 2 parts. It includes the submittal of an online letter of interest I may refer to it as a pre-application. I'm using those two terms interchangeably throughout the presentation. That pre-application is due very soon, and I have a timeline at the end. And then that pre-application is followed by a final application. Eligible applicants must have the match for the project in hand, or it must be committed from an additional funding source before final applications are submitted. And the organization must confirm that the match is in place before a grant contract is executed. Eligible applicants are nonprofit organizations with a 501c3 status. We get lots of questions about this, but 501c7, 501c8, fraternal organizations, social clubs, recreational clubs, benefit societies, those types of organizations are not eligible for the grant. Also not eligible are schools and religious organizations, despite their 501c3 status, as well as municipalities are not eligible applicants. Other requirements is that the applicant must own the building in which the grant project is being applied for, or they must hold some kind of long-term lease or have some kind of formal agreement with the owner that's long-term for use. And for the purpose of this grant program, the building has to be historic, obviously, and that includes buildings that are listed on the Connecticut State or National Register of Historic Places, or buildings that are 50 years or older with demonstrable historic significance. And finally, eligible applicants may not have other 1772 Foundation grants open at the time of their application. So the 1772 Foundation provides a fairly concrete list of eligible project types, and project proposals must fall into one or more of these categories. And they should also adhere to historic preservation best practices, which include repair of materials over replacement. When materials need to be replaced, they should be replaced in kind, meeting with like and historically appropriate materials. The project categories include exterior painting, exterior finishes and surface restoration, so carpentry repairs, masonry repairs, fire detection, lighting protection, and security systems, repairs and restoration of porches, roofs, and windows, repairs and stabilization of foundations and sills, and finally, chimney and general masonry repair. And ineligible, this may not be a complete list of ineligible projects, but these are some of the ones that were asked about most often. Ineligible projects include really any new construction, the wholesale replacement of historic materials. So for example, replacing all of the historic clapboards off of a historic house and replacing them with new ones, or replacing all the historic windows with new. Treatments that will adversely and permanently impact the historic character of the property are ineligible. So, for example, removing an architectural character defining feature or a permanent alteration that changes the historic character of a property. The grant also will not pay for mechanical systems, HVAC systems. And finally, projects that utilize historically inappropriate, untested, or materials that are known to harm historic materials are also ineligible, and these can include things like vinyl or synthetic replacement materials, elastomer paints, and water repellent masonry treatments, things like that. And if you're unsure if a project is eligible or ineligible based on the list, I strongly suggest that you reach out to us, and there'll be a contact at the end. So I want to just turn quickly to some of the philosophies of the 1772 Foundation before I go into what makes a compelling application and what are some of the funding priorities. The 1772 Foundation is focused on what they call dynamic preservation, which they define as a forward-thinking approach that goes beyond traditional conservation of historic buildings and landmarks. It emphasizes adaptability, inclusivity, and community engagement to ensure that preservation efforts remain relevant and impactful in a rapidly changing world. This approach involves integrating modern technologies, sustainable practices, and creative uses of historic spaces to meet contemporary needs of communities and historic preservationists. And finally, dynamic preservation includes a commitment to telling broader and more inclusive ranges of stories, ensuring that diverse voices and histories are represented and celebrated. And of course, Preservation Connecticut's mission is to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut communities. So the strongest applicants will demonstrate one or more of the following in their application. A little out of order here, but historical significance. The grants are obviously designed to help and protect and promote historic places and the historical significance of a building, as well as the applicant's ability to articulate that significance is an important factor in our selection process. Historic places that are associated with or tell the stories of underrepresented peoples or communities should also be highlighted in applications. Urgency, urgent projects that protect the integrity of a historic building are often given priority in the selection process, particularly projects that address things like active water infiltration, structural instability, barriers to visitor accessibility, or safety are often given preference and should be highlighted in both pre-applications and applications. Commitment to preservation. Applicants that demonstrate a history of good preservation stewardship, or organizations that may not have a track record of preservation but have a clear set of preservation goals, will be given priority. Commitment to preservation can be demonstrated in many ways, including but not limited to the success of previous projects, including both capital projects and planning, the activity of the organization's building committee or facility staff, and the creation and adherence to professional preservation or internal maintenance plans. Community. Organizations that play an active role in their community generally make strong applicants. Community activities, of course, can include a wide array of events and programs, but in general, we're looking for solid evidence that the organization is open to the public and has or will have, after preservation work is complete, significant local or regional public benefit. The 1772 Foundation also focuses on creativity, so the creative reuse of historic spaces without adversely impacting their historic integrity. Projects that incorporate that will be given preference, as well as sustainability, organizations that factor in climate change into their, not only their projects, but also their long-term planning for their buildings. And again, I'll say that projects that incorporate best practices, we use the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties to evaluate different projects that come in, but essentially best practices again includes repair of material over replacement, and when materials need to be replaced, they should be replaced in kind using historically appropriate materials, and any work should be done by qualified individuals with relevant historic preservation experience. So we went over this. Okay. We're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes, but I'm going to go over a few frequently asked questions first. I apologize. It looks like this list, maybe I have the old slideshow up, but I have a few more that are not on this list that I'll go over quickly. One of the most common questions that we get asked is, can the grant be used to cover work that's already been completed or started? And the answer is no. That grants cannot fund projects that retroactively that have already been started. Is interior work eligible? Generally not, unless it's structural or otherwise associated with an exterior repair. Can the funds be used to match SHPO or other state or federal funds? Yes, the answer is yes. The 1772 Foundation grants are private and can be used to match state and federal grant sources. How long does the applicant have to complete the project? It's 1 year from the time that the contract is signed. And another question we often get is what happens if the organization does not complete the project within 1 year? Preservation Connecticut may extend the grant timeline. However, that's not a guarantee. And applications will be evaluated based on evidence of project readiness and the likelihood that the project will be completed within 1 year. Applicants not ready to complete a project within 1 year should consider waiting to apply. We're often asked if the grant is competitive, and it is. We receive about 60 to 80 letters of interest or pre-applications every year. We generally invite 20 to 25 applicants and usually fund 12 to 14 projects. Another question we get is, can my organization apply to do work to more than one building? And the answer there is no, typically not, unless there's some kind of benefit to doing projects maybe with two buildings in close proximity to each other, maybe like security systems or lighting systems, fire detection, things like that. But generally, no. Is there a limit on how big a project can be? There's no official limit on how big a project can be, but projects generally over $50,000 are usually not considered, as there are other resources, particularly through the State Historic Preservation Office, that has larger grant funding sources that are better suited for large projects. And how is funding distributed? So unlike some other grant programs, if you are awarded, Preservation Connecticut will distribute 100% of the funds upon receipt of a contract, so before a project is started. Yeah. Well, finally, I'll just say that, if there is, we'll inevitably get questions if my organization is not invited to apply, what should I do next? And that is reach out to us, schedule a visit with one of our circuit riders, and we can talk about potential alternative funding sources, as well as maybe improving applications in the future. Another thing I will say, this is commonly asked for folks that are anticipating being invited to apply. If an organization is invited to apply, you will need to have a clear scope of work, financial match in hand, your last 990 form, and 3 competitive bids from qualified contractors. And we also require that invited applicants make an appointment to meet with one of our circuit riders about their project before an application is submitted. So the next steps, if you're interested in the grant, filling out an inquiry form, you could see the address here, and maybe we can send it out after. But it's preservationct.org//1772 inquiry. One of the tips I can give anyone that's submitting a pre-application, particularly if it's your first time applying with our organization, is to make sure that you include good photos. We really can't evaluate the need of projects or buildings without good photos, particularly if we have not been there. The inquiries are due at the 13th at 5 p.m. There was a time when we accepted paper copies. That's no longer true. All the pre-applications, letters of inquiries must be submitted through our online portal. And invitations to apply will be sent shortly thereafter on December 20th. Final applications being due the 15th of February, and grant awards being announced in April 2025. And again, whether you're thinking about applying for the grant this year, if you're not invited to apply, or if you are invited to apply, please feel free to use our contact form to set up a site visit, or you can reach directly out to me. I'll have my email up at the end of the presentation. And finally, thank you, Amherst and the Connecticut League of Museums, for inviting me to speak with you. And thank you to the 1772 Foundation now for 14 years of continued support and partnership with Preservation Connecticut. And if you have any questions, you could reach out to me, Mike Forino, mforino at preservationct.org, or my colleague Stefan Danchuk. His email is there as well.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'll let you leave that up for a couple of minutes so people
Sure.
can take down your information, and then you can come out of the screen share. We have a bunch of questions that have come through in the chat, so I'll queue those up first, and then we can open things up to a broader Q&A. The first question was about funds that can be used for a match. So can someone apply for a grant for those matching funds?
To match this, they're asking to match the 1772
Yeah.
Foundation grant. Yeah, so as I said, it is private money, so of course you can use other private foundation funding, community foundations, Hartford Community Foundation, things like that, to match the 1772 funding. But also, as I said, very common match is the State Historic Preservation's Office's Historic Restoration Fund grant. Lots of folks try to link up those two grant sources together as a match. If there's specific questions about, what types of sources can be used to match, I'm happy to answer those. But generally, because it's private foundation money, really any grant source can be used to match it.
Right. I'm going to come out of the share now so that we can see each other. So Aaron asks, part of the property for which we would be applying for such a grant is over 50 years old, but it has a 2000 addition. Would that make them ineligible when the part that's undergoing restoration is the older part of the building?
No, yeah, this happens frequently in historic societies. Museums will have a historic building with a modern addition. The grant funds won't cover any work to the modern addition, but it will for the older part of the facility. Yes.
Great, thanks. Aaron asks, if the foundation of our building isn't watertight, can ceiling work be an approved use of the funding?
Yes, that would fall under foundation repair, and actually, it's I think a good project because it brings in sustainability and climate change, factoring those things into your long-term plans for your building. Again, the work would need to adhere to best preservation practices, and we're happy to work with you on a scope to make sure that it does that. But absolutely, it would be eligible.
Great, thanks. Paula from Discovering Amistad asks, so we own and operate the Connecticut flagship Amistad, which is a historic floating museum, not a building, but a historic tall ship. Are they eligible?
That's a really good question, and not one that I get very often. I'm not sure. We'd have to talk about that a little more, but it's a really interesting question.
Okay, great. Paula, maybe you should shoot Mike an email.
Yeah, no, I'd like to talk to you
Definitely.
about it.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks, Paula.
definitely.
Barbara asks, it appears that interior floors may not be considered. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, correct. Interior work generally is not considered for the grant.
Okay. Robin asks, are the 3 competitive quotes required when you submit the initial letter of inquiry, or just when you submit the complete application if you're invited to apply?
Excellent question. No, you don't need the 3 competitive bids at the time of the pre-application. The pre-application is fairly easy. You really just need a basic project details and estimated cost. The estimated costs don't need to be based on, on professional quotes. So great question. No, if you're invited to apply, then you'll be required to submit quotes. But I like to bring that up because it's kind of a short timeline between when you'll be invited to apply till when the application's due. So, starting to think about that as a possibility, it's good to do now.
Yeah, good to know in advance. Thanks for that clarification. Anne is hoping that you'll be able to share this presentation with the group when I send a follow-up email afterward. Would you be willing to share the slides?
Yes,
Great.
absolutely.
Excellent. So, and everybody else will get a copy of the slides out to you in our follow-up email, as well as a link to the recording. Susan asks, can money in our maintenance reserve be used to match funding?
Yes, absolutely. If it's the organization's funding and it's not related to, um, well, if it's not related to another 1772 project, then yes, it can be used to match.
Anne asks, what documentation is needed to provide a cost for the project? Do people, I know it sounds like you'll need competitive quotes for that full application, but what are you looking for in terms of substantiation for the full grant request?
The quotes are really the important part. If some organizations may have things called condition assessments or work done by architects, so they might already have estimates for work um, before they even go out to bid or solicit quotes for projects. We'd be interested in seeing that information as well. Really, I will say that one of the, and not directly related to the question, but one of the most important things to consider when soliciting bids is that you really need to have a clear scope of work so that you have like bids. Everyone's bidding on the same thing. Very often we see that if scopes of work are not clearly defined, that you'll get contractor bids that are all over the place, and that really makes it difficult to determine, the work that really needs to be done and what the cost of that work should really be.
Right.
And again, those are kind of, we can answer specific questions, over the phone or on a site visit.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I assume that you folks can help people with defining that scope if they're invited to apply, to sort of narrow it to ensure that those bids are, the way that you want to see them.
Exactly. Yep.
Great. Anne asks, we are approaching 20 years since a major rehabilitation and addition project to our historic carriage house and want to do a condition assessment. Does Connecticut have a particular template that they advise using, or a National Park Service one?
So condition assessments are usually documents that are produced by if an architectural firm or a architect and an engineer together. So there's no, every firm uses a different format. There's no general form that I know of. I will say that I'm sure you're already looking at this, but the State Historic Preservation Office has a survey and planning grant program that can be used to pay for condition assessments for buildings that are listed on the state or national register. And that's something we'd be happy to talk more in detail about as well.
Right. Yeah. And some of these, I think Mike and I can talk about some additional links to send along in the follow-up email as well.
Yeah, we'd be
Including
happy
links
to
to
do that too.
some of the opportunities from the State Historic Preservation Office. Melinda asks if the matching funds can be donated by a local resident and not from a grant.
Yes, absolutely. Again, the source, it doesn't quite matter, but yeah, private donation absolutely can be used.
Great. There was a quick question from Aaron, whose internet cut out when we were discussing the pre-application. Is that done through email or a link to the portal?
That's a link through on our website, and I think if we haven't sent that already, we'll send it with the follow-up materials.
Janet asks if a discrete phase of a larger project is eligible. Could you use these funds to do a piece of what is, I know you were talking about kind of like really huge projects, maybe this isn't quite the right grant for, but what if you have sort of like a phase of something larger that you're building for? Is this an appropriate fund for that?
Harder to answer. It kind of depends on the project. Maybe is really not the best answer, but the only one that I have. It is possible that, the grant we have used the grant to fund discrete phases of work. I think a lot of it depends on the timing of the rest of the work. Is it all being done, within a year or two, or is it spread out over time? I think probably preference would be given to projects that are spread out over time as opposed to being done, in larger or more collapse sequence. But again, happy to talk offline about, specific project details.
Yeah. Janet, sounds like you should get in touch with Mike.
Yeah.
Sandy asks if bringing the building entry into ADA compliance be a covered sort of project, talking about a ramp or entry door widening.
Generally not, because again, it's maintenance and repair, and accessibility projects are really they're modification to the structure. There are potential other grant sources for that type of work, which which we could hopefully point you to, but generally no. I'd say that the answer is no.
Okay, thanks. Erin asks what sort of documentation you require as proof of the funding that you have in hand for the match. How does the grant require reporting to show proof that that match is one-to-one?
Yeah, so we'll have an idea about the project cost from the estimates. So we'll know what the project is going to cost at the end of or throughout the project. There's really only two reporting requirements. There's an interim report, which takes place about 6 months after the contract has been executed, in which you give, assuming that the project hasn't been complete, you give an update on the project. And then there's a final report due a year later, in which case you'll submit all the contractor, the contract that you signed, all of the canceled, or all the copies of checks and payments and invoices and things like that. So it's not really the requirements aren't too stringent, but really contractor invoices is what we're looking for at the end. And to answer the first question, which was, how do we determine whether or not the match is in hand? We generally, if it's an organization with a board of directors, or it could be the executive director, we just usually ask that they write some kind of letter confirming that the match is in place.
Great, thank you. I'll put a link in the chat to information about this grant line on Preservation Connecticut's website. But Susan is wondering if there are written guidelines that you have either up on that website or in a document that folks could look at.
Oh, for the grant application itself?
Yeah. We
don't have anything up, because generally that information is shared with the folks that are invited to apply. But if people are interested, we can send out an old PDF copy of last year's application if people are interested in looking at that. It may change slightly if you're invited again this year, but we're happy to do that too.
Okay, great, thank you. Andrew asks, is partial replacement of the clapboarding of a building's exterior allowed, even if wholesale replacement is not?
Replacement when needed is allowed. So if a material can't be repaired, and clapboards often are beyond repair, yes, some of them can be replaced. It's just the idea, we don't want to see boards and materials being replaced that essentially can be repaired. So it depends on the amount of damage that they have. But great question.
Excellent. All right, that's all I'm seeing in the chat for now. I'm going to change my view to a gallery in case we have any additional questions. Does anybody else want to raise their hand or unmute themselves, or have any additional questions for Mike?
I do have a question. This is Susan Porter.
Hi, Susan.
Hi. We have a large moisture problem, and would any remediation in the basement, would that fall under this grant? I mean, it does affect the whole building, from, holding paint to the collection storage too.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it depends on what type of remediation. We've used the grant, for example, to alleviate issues with water infiltration into basements by putting new gutters on the building.
Oh, okay.
things like that. So yes, so depending on exactly what needs to be done. The
Okay,
general answer is yes, if it's protecting the building, and it's also related to, changes in climate and
right.
sustainability.
Okay,
So yeah,
so
I'd be happy to talk more about that.
repointing the stones in the foundation would also be acceptable?
Yeah, that
Oh,
would fall under
okay,
structural,
okay,
structural foundation repair. So yes,
okay,
absolutely.
great. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
great. Thanks, Susan, for your question. Andrew's got another one in the chat. Have you ever encountered a situation where there are not 3 contractors available to offer a bid?
Often, which, yes, it's a great question. It is often the case that folks can't find 3 contractors. In that case, that of course, you're already invited to apply at that point. In that case, we will usually accept 2 if there's, evidence that you've reached out to other folks and can't get an answer. But unfortunately, that does happen. It is, it's hard to find folks that are able to work on a lot of these projects, particularly if they're specific. So that's a great question. And if you are invited to apply and are having trouble, we'd, like I said, we may be able to waive that requirement. The other thing I will say is that if you are invited to apply, actually, this goes for any folks that have any work even outside of the grant. If you have a scope of work that you'd like advertised, you can send it to us and we'll put it up on our website. We'll also send it to lists of contractors that we've collected over time to see if we could help get you a response.
Oh, that's great. And who should that go to at Preservation Connecticut?
That could go to me.
Okay.
There is also there's a form that you could fill
Oh,
out
okay.
under the resources tab of our website. But
Mm.
if you have any trouble finding it or forget about that, you could reach out to me and I'll direct you to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. Ruthie asks, buildings that have been moved to a different and town-owned property, would they be covered by the Historical Society? And Ruthie, if you want to unmute yourself and share a little bit more here, maybe that would be helpful because I think it probably has to do with who owns the building.
Yeah, generally I'd say that again, it kind of depends, historical significance often depends on where the building is located. So I'd say that's the biggest question. But we have funded projects for buildings that have been moved.
Okay. I wasn't clear, Ruth, if these were, they're buildings that the Historical Society manages, but they have been moved. And I don't know if there's any more that you want to share about that, that would help Mike answer your question. But if not, maybe the 2 of you can connect offline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Any additional questions? These are all wonderful. iPad 3, do you have something?
Yeah, I can't figure out how to put my name on it.
That's fine.
I was just typing. I'm with the Simsbury Historic Society, and for our 300th anniversary from 1670 to 1970, we built a replica meeting house, which is now more than 50 years old and needs help with siding. And I wasn't involved back then, though I was still around. I believe they try to do the kind of wood and old nails back then to make it fairly authentic, but it hasn't held up so well. So either we patch certain boards and still use the old method, or, I mean, so is it eligible to do some exterior? It's right in the middle of town. Everybody sees it.
Yeah, there's some hard questions here. That's a hard one. I mean, replica buildings can be historic in their own right, definitely. So I'd say generally, yes, it could be, we could consider it historic based on the case that you as the applicant can make for that. And it is over 50 years old. So I'd say that generally it is eligible.
Okay,
But, anything that I will say just generally not explicitly related to your project, but to all projects, because the grant is very competitive, keep that in the back of your mind as you're selecting projects to apply for. And, I'd also encourage everyone to take a look at, and maybe we could send this too, but previous awardees, applicants that have received the grants over, say, the last 3 or 4 years might be useful to get some kind of idea of what is being funded.
okay.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Mike? I'm going to page through the screens in case I'm not seeing anybody. Mike, what I might just ask a sort of general question that if I were an applicant, I would want to know, what do you feel makes, since it is such a competitive pool for this funding, I assume it's really important to kind of make the case for all of those things you were talking about at the top: historical significance, the urgency of the project, the organization's commitment to preservation, sustainability and climate change, the kinds of stories that the property connects to, and its public use and the way it's being used in creative ways. Do you have like particular guidance you would give folks on, when you read an application, what are the sorts of things that you're seeing that are making it really stand out?
Yeah, for me, that's a great question. I think for me, one of the things that stands out the most is of course historical significance in the story behind the building itself. I'm a historian, so that's an obvious one. But I think beyond that, really the role that the organization plays in the community. And often, we're in a post-COVID world, lots of places have struggled. So, I often get questions of, well, people will say, well, we used to do all these programs, but now we've kind of, slowed down after the pandemic. And I would say that almost equally as compelling as folks that do a lot with their community are folks that have great plans to do things in the future. That's equally important. So if a building is, not really in service or it's underutilized, but preservation work may put it back in service or increase its visibility, those are also things that I personally will look for. But the problem is, and you didn't exactly address, but there's so many worthy projects out there every year. It's a really difficult task to pick.
Yeah, I think there's never enough money for all of the projects that are out there, right? Even at the federal level. So definitely, I think we're all in this room familiar with that challenge. I'm sure even Preservation Connecticut is familiar with that challenge in the nonprofit sector and in the preservation sector. So I think we seem to be winding down here in terms of particular questions. I'm assuming if folks have additional follow-up things that aren't addressed in the information that we're going to be sending out to everyone who registered, that they should get in touch with you or your colleagues at Preservation Connecticut with their questions. And I'm just trying to make a list for myself of what we want to include. We want to have the slides and the recording, the link to where to submit your projects for consideration.
Yep. Yeah.
Obviously, the information about the grant and how to apply, and SHPO's grant opportunities, and any other particular things, and maybe more about 1772 if people are interested. It's always good to get a sense of the groups giving the money and where their strategic priorities are, as well as Preservation Connecticut. So if you're applying for funding, right? So,
Right.
Catherine has a question too. Catherine, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, just as the grant maker, I'm curious, in terms of your grant making goals, are there ever a type of project that you wish you were funding more, but you just don't get applications for them? Like, do they tend to cluster in one area, but there's kind of an area of, for some reason, we just don't see people asking for this or looking for that area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, um, the majority of the projects that we have funded are typically small museums and historical societies or other cultural organizations that, exist in, historic buildings or historic houses. And those are great. And I think that really the spirit of the program when it started was meant to target those smaller organizations. What we don't see a lot of, and of course, we already have limited funding, so you got to be careful what you wish for. But what we don't see a lot of, and what I would like to see, are more nonprofit organizations that aren't historical societies. Um, maybe they're housing or organizations, or they're some kind of social welfare organization, something like that exists within a historic building. We don't see, every once in a while we get one of those. We had office building exterior restoration from New Haven Housing, for example, a few years ago, and that was a unique organizational type, not a resource type, but organizational type. So it's really a great question. Actually, I'll also say that, a lot of our projects kind of tend to exist in smaller towns. We don't get as many 1772 projects in urban, in the cities as much. That's a great question.
Okay, so, and just to extend that a little bit, if the organization, even if they were smaller town historical society, but if they're thinking about their larger area, and how they're serving, for example, the, county-wide populations are bringing people in, it sounds like that would be of interest.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't want to stress that too much, because I know,
Okay.
the reach of a small organization is,
Yeah.
might only be so far. So I don't want to say we're not going to fund places that don't have a large regional reach, but certainly activity within their own community is really, really important.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Great. And there's lots of praise for all this information coming through in the chat. So, Mike, you've done a great job laying out
Great, thank you.
this project. I'm also reminded that we'll also circulate, if you're comfortable, the PDF from last year's application, because it sounds like some
Yes.
folks would find it useful to sort of have a preview of what the next stage could look like if they were invited to apply.
Yeah, we're happy to do that.
And I'll also mention that in addition to, it's great to get your feedback in the chat. There's going to be an evaluation form for this program going out. And if you loved it, if you had constructive feedback, we'd love to hear about it, as well as any ideas about programs that you would like to see from the League. Thank you so much for being here. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions, and Mike may have a few minutes as well
I could
for a
do
little
that as well.
one-on-one. But I want to take this opportunity to thank Mike Forino and all the rest of the staff at Preservation Connecticut for their work putting this program together, for their willingness to share more about this grant opportunity, and to all of you for being here to learn and ask questions. I hope that Preservation Connecticut will be getting lots of letters of inquiry as a result of this program. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're hoping to collaborate more with the folks at Preservation Connecticut, share more information about their grant and funding opportunities. And as many of you know, their Circuit Rider program is an excellent way to get advice on what you should be doing with your historic structures. So I definitely recommend checking out their website for the other excellent things that they do, in addition to the preservation conversations that they host and their ongoing programs. It's a really great way to be connected. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Enjoy the rain. And I will also say we're doing another funding spotlight the week after Thanksgiving about the 250th edition of the Museum Makeover Program. So we'll include a link to sign up for that in the follow-up email as well. You can also go to our website, ctleague.org, and see it in the upcoming programs. Thank you for being here and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.